The irony to me was that the Energy Information Administration just came out and said, we are now the largest oil producer of all time, of any country. So not just number one in the world, number one ever in history.
My name is Mike Mauceli, and this is the Energy Show with REI Energy, where we're energizing your investments and maximizing your tax deductions. Today, you're going to discover how artificial intelligence requires a massive amount of electricity and burdens our already stressed grid. My guest today is Robert Rapier. Robert is a chemical engineer in the energy industry and also the editor-in-chief for Shale Magazine. Great to have you on the show today, Robert.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so I read your article that you wrote not too long ago, and I wanted to talk a lot about electric vehicles today, but I also wanted to get your opinion because, the administration, I mean, we have been fighting this now for 2 to 3 years. I mean, every time we turn around, we hear that, Biden and his administration, their main number one goal is to put the oil and gas industry out of business. But more recently, I was reading in one of your articles where the U.S. is now the number one energy producer, but also we are the number one oil and gas producer in the world again. And I just wanted to get your opinion on how that happened.
Yeah, so it's interesting. In a nutshell, it happened because of fracking. I mean, that's how it happened. Oil and gas had been on a long, long decline from about 1970 until the mid 2000s. And that's when producers were experimenting with horizontal drilling and fracking. And natural gas turned upward about 2004, 2005. And then oil production turned upward in 2009. Ironically, it was Obama's first year in office. And I've always said the irony is that George Bush was an oil man, but oil declined all 8 years he was in office. But what was happening is fracking was being developed and production finally turned up Obama's first year in office. And then we went on the largest expansion of oil and gas production in U.S. history. And that has continued. And so, yes, Biden campaigned on getting us off oil and gas, and yet we've continued to set records. And I say the biggest takeaway from that is presidents don't have a lot of power over oil and gas production or oil and gas prices in the short term. In the long term, they can put policies in place that can have a detrimental effect or a positive effect over time. But the irony to me was that the Energy Information Administration just came out and said, we are now the largest oil producer of all time, of any country. So not just number one in the world, number one ever in history, which is amazing. And in his State of the Union address, President Biden didn't mention oil. One time he said the word oil, and that was, we're going to end tax breaks on big oil. He didn't mention natural gas at all. And, we are by far the top natural gas producer. We have been instrumental in keeping prices under control in Europe with our LNG exports after Russia invaded Ukraine and cut off a lot of exports to Europe. The U.S. did all that, and that did not get a mention in the State of the Union, which I thought was curious. But I think it's politics. I think Biden has got to appease the left, the far left of his base, and campaigning on getting rid of oil and gas, and then acknowledging we're producing more oil and gas than we ever have before is not something that he necessarily wants to highlight.
Yeah, I agree with you. In fact, my company, we've been involved up in the Bakken, North Dakota, since about 2011, and currently in a very active shale play over in Oklahoma. And one thing that I've noticed is that the rig count has actually gone down, but
Right.
yet we are the number one producer of all times, as you were saying, and that's got to be due to technology, right?
It's better technology, but there's also a lag there. I mean, rig count starts to fall and fall and fall. Eventually, that can impact oil production. So, technology can't completely overcome, a plummeting rig count. That will show up in production down the line. But so far, not yet. I think we set another production record this year. And then after that, I think rig count's going to have to come back up a little bit if we're going to continue to expand over the rest of this decade.
I think one of the big things that's happening now, and in fact, I read about it. I think the CEO of Exxon had come out with an article before the first of the year where They've been developing new frac technology. And, what we're seeing up in the Bakken, up in North Dakota, is that more and more companies are starting to refrac some of the older wells that were drilled in 2010, 2011. And in fact, I think one company has about 200 of them scheduled this year. And we're currently participating in some of them. So I think the new technology is definitely going to help revitalize some of these old wells, don't you?
Yeah, yeah, I agree. And
Yeah.
it just shows that the energy transition is a little further away, I mean, than people thought. And I've said that. I've said, unintended consequences of trying to shut down oil and gas before you're ready to shut down oil and gas could be severe. You could end up being back, dependent on OPEC again, dependent on Venezuela and countries like that, if you're hurting your own domestic production.
And I think one thing that people don't realize, and maybe you can touch a little bit on this, is that, our oil is some of the cleanest oil in the world, correct?
That is correct. And so, if the demand for oil is there and we're not getting it from the US or from Canada, which is a pretty reliable trading partner, we may be getting it from countries that have very low environmental standards, that have emissions that are far, far greater associated with extracting oil and gas, and that have worker safety standards that are, appalling. So, by getting oil and gas in the US, the overall environmental consequences are a lot lower than if we were getting it, from some foreign countries.
I think a lot of people, I mean, they look at the price of oil and gas, and today, it's in its mid 70s, upper 70s, and close to $80 a barrel. And I think our lifting cost and some of the shale plays are, around 35, $36 a barrel. So, oil can't go much lower. I mean, I hear a lot of people saying, well, we're going to start producing all this oil, but we're expecting the price to come down. Now it can come down some, but I think as long as we're kind of hovering in this price range, I think it's a pretty good price, not only for the consumer, but also for the energy company to
Yeah.
find and produce new oil.
Yeah, it's, $70, $80 is a pretty good sweet spot. I think oil and gas producers are making decent money. And I think OPEC would like to see it higher. I think
Yeah.
OPEC would like to see prices on up there a little bit more. But yeah, for US producers, this is a nice spot, and it's not extremely painful for consumers.
That that's kind of my thoughts on it as far as that. So I wanted to also touch, you were talking a little bit about natural gas. Well, Biden and his administration came out and said that they're going to shelve the LNG, this large LNG project. I mean, is that going to hurt us as far as a competitor in some of these European countries?
So down the road, it may. Of course, that can always be overturned later on. But my objection to shelving these LNG export terminals is the over the past 15 years, the U.S. has the largest decline in carbon dioxide emissions of any country in the world. And the reason is natural gas. The number one reason is natural gas. Natural gas shutting down coal-fired power plants. So if you are shutting down LNG export, that could have helped shut down coal-fired power plants in places around the world, you're really hurting emissions. You're making emissions worse. And I understand the reasons clean energy advocates went to Biden and said, hey, we can't keep expanding fossil fuel infrastructure. Natural gas is still a fossil fuel. It's putting carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. That's true. But if it's replacing coal, it has less than half the associated emissions per electric energy output as coal. So we've expanded natural gas consumption in the US enormously, and yet our emissions have fallen a lot. And it's because natural gas replaced coal. And so that's one of those unintended consequences. You look at it and go, yeah, we shouldn't expand natural gas production if we want to rein in carbon emissions. But then when you say, well, it's shutting down coal, and it actually did reduce carbon emissions. So unintended consequences.
Yeah, and I think, of course, in my opinion, I think that when you look at all of the trillions of dollars, I guess, or hundreds of billions, whatever the number is, that in subsidies and throwing all of this at green energy. I mean, green energy, wind and solar is still only about 20% of the market, right? Oil and gas is still supplies about 80%. Is that correct?
Yeah, oil and gas is still around 80%, and it hasn't changed tremendously over the past 20 years. I mean, because our energy demands have grown and as energy demand grows, I've written several articles that the increase in renewables is not even enough to keep up with the increase in demand. So as long as that's the case, renewables aren't going to be shutting down oil and gas. They're not even able to keep up with demand overall. So, don't get me wrong. I'm pro renewable. I'm all for renewables. I think we ought to be doing as much as we can there.
Yeah.
But it's unreasonable to think that renewables are going to rapidly end our dependence on fossil fuels.
Well, I agree with you. I mean, we have close to 8 billion people in this country, in the world now, so we need every form of energy we can get our hands on because, oil and gas is a depleting asset, and at some point way down the road, it's going to become harder and harder to find.
Right.
And but I also, wanted to see if you could kind of touch on a little bit, and I don't know how much you know on this subject, but about the refining capability, because I think that that's where we're really hurting in this country, right? Is the lack of refineries.
Right. That we have lost some refineries over the past few years. Refining capacity in the U.S. is not expanding. I'd have to look, but I think we're down a little bit over the past decade in our refining capacity. And yeah, that's a bottleneck. But a lot of our refining does so. The oil we produce, the light oil we produce, a lot
Right.
of it now is exported, and the U.S. brings in heavy oil. We refine it because our refiners have tooled to take heavy sour oils over the past 40 or 50 years, and then they export. And so we are now significant net exporter of finished products like gasoline and diesel. And that's been a boom for U.S. refiners. I mean, you look at stock prices on Valero and Phillips 66 and Marathon. I mean, they are up 200 and 300% over the last 3 or 4 years. I mean, big stock moves in those companies. So they're not hurting, but yes, we do have some shortages of refining capacity, and that does hurt us some.
Well, that's great. I appreciate you touching on that. So now we can kind of talk about our main topic, which was electric vehicles. So when we started all this, and
Right.
I know that they're starting to pile up on these dealers' parking lots, and I don't think people are embracing them as much as Biden and his administration would like us to embrace them. Correct?
Right. So it's funny. I gave a talk in Utah about, gosh, probably about 2018. And that was one of the questions they asked. They said, when are we all going to be forced to drive electric vehicles? And it was a cold, snowy day, and I'd walk through the parking lot, and it was full of four-wheel drives, and it was full of rugged vehicles. And I said, 10 years from now, that parking lot's going to look exactly like it does now. I said, there's not going to be a bunch of electric vehicles out there because for very rural areas, spread out areas, and the United States is a rural country. We're spread out. There's a lot of things that don't work here very well, like they do in Europe. Like our train systems, their population density is so great that their public transportation systems in Europe are much more well developed than ours. We're just too spread out. If we had very high population density centers, then maybe we'd have more mass transit and we'd have better adoption of electric vehicles. But as it stands, I think you had a lot of early adopters that bought electric vehicles, but then most consumers are sitting back saying, I'm going to wait a little bit because this is still not, they're still very expensive. This is not super convenient for me. I can't easily I can hop in my car right now and drive across the country. But if I had an electric vehicle, that's not going to be as easy. I've got to carefully plan out my route. I've got to figure out where I can charge. If I run out of gas in the middle of nowhere, it's not that big a deal for me to get, gas and get going again. But if my battery dies in the middle of Nebraska, I may have a problem there. And I think people have a concern about that range anxiety, the length of time it takes to charge. And that's starting to show up in slowing growth. And that's what's hitting the electric vehicle companies. Electric vehicle manufacturers' stock prices now are down across the board. And that's what's going on. They had forecast that, we'd all be driving electric vehicles 10 years from now. And the demand projections were, sky high. And now they're saying that there's a lot of warning signs, and electric vehicle companies are warning that, growth is slowing down. Hertz had to take a big hit to profits last year because they had this very aggressive move to put, I think, 150,000 electric vehicles out in their fleet, and they ended up costing them a lot more money than they expected. And the funny thing was, they said the repair costs were very high for these electric vehicles. Um, and so Hertz is now, they took a hit to profits, I think, in Q3 last year. And then they said, we're scaling back. We're selling some of our electric vehicle fleet, and we're buying gasoline, internal combustion engines to replace those. And I think that's what's going on. It's not that electric vehicles won't continue to grow. I think they will, but adoption is going to be slow for skeptical people who are used to pulling into the gas station and filling their car up in 5 minutes and being on their way and not really having any range anxiety. Having a reasonable priced vehicle, it's the entry point is pretty high still for most of these electric vehicles. People, and with interest rates as high as they are, that's another problem. You go out and you buy a brand new electric vehicle and you have high interest rates right now. That's a problem for people.
And plus the longevity of the batteries. I mean, how long does a battery last?
Yeah, that's going to be a big issue. I've always said this: when we have a bunch of batteries start to have to be replaced, that's when people are going to go, "Oh wow, this is much worse than having to replace an engine in a vehicle." I mean, engine in a vehicle might last, 200 or 300,000 miles. Electric vehicle, the batteries are going to be gone, in I've seen, 8 years, 6 to 10 years, something like that. That's going to be a massive capital expenditure back into your car. And that's why the depreciation, that was the other thing Hertz said, depreciation was really high on these electric vehicles. And we're going to have a big problem coming down the road because we're not ready for all these batteries that are going to have to be, recycled. We don't have the recycling capabilities. So whenever they do have to be replaced, those batteries are going to end up getting shipped to China for recycling, probably.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I drive a truck, and heck, that truck almost costs as much as a house now, and electric vehicles are more expensive than that almost. But the battery, I guess, is what, a third or two-thirds of the cost of the whole car. And you
Yeah,
go
it's a
to
significant chunk of that. And I mean, you can't force consumer behavior. You can incentivize it, and they've tried to do that, but the incentives were taken by all the early adopters, and now some of the incentives are running out. And I think skeptical people are just saying, I'm going to wait a little bit longer before I do this. And I'm confident that in 2030, all those people that I saw in Utah are still going to be driving internal combustion engine. They're all across the Midwest, and maybe in heavy population centers like Los Angeles, maybe New York, some of these big cities, maybe you'll see a lot of electric vehicle adoption, but across the country, I don't see it.
Yeah, in my opinion, I think we'll see, like you were saying, in more of the urban areas where, we have a lot more hybrids. That makes a lot more sense to me than having just all
Yeah,
out electric vehicles.
for
And
sure.
what impact does that have on the grid? I mean, we haven't really talked about that yet, but I mean, could we even handle a population that 70 or 80% of the cars were on our current grid structure in the US?
We certainly could not handle that today, and that is a big concern. And that's another problem with planning. If you think everybody's going to be on electric vehicles a decade from now, you've got to have massive investments in grid infrastructure, and a massive increase in electrical production capacity. But if the projections are off, then maybe you invested a lot of money into the grid that was a little premature. So these things become important. We've got to adjust as we go on, and we may see, okay, electric vehicles aren't coming on as fast as we thought they would. Therefore, we can spread those grid investments out on a little bit longer time frame than we thought.
And that's not even including the new AI that's supposed to be able to, I mean, suppose you need so much electricity in order to operate a lot of those data centers, correct?
Correct. The AI data centers do consume a lot of power. There's a lot of computing power that goes into those. I've been talking about AI for a couple of years now, and I've learned to use it in my work. I do a lot of question and answer with
Mhm.
AI, and I'll say, if I see a word I don't understand, explain this to me. And they do still hallucinate sometimes. The thing about AI, if you don't know enough about the topic and you're just a layperson and you say, write me an article about the oil industry, it's going to get facts wrong. And if you don't know enough about it, if you're just a layperson trying to pass yourself off as an expert using AI, you're going to mess up. You're going to make mistakes. And that's the thing about the AIs. I use them a lot. I catch them making mistakes a lot. Anytime there's a new chatbot available, I will usually test it out. And the first thing I always ask it is, who is Robert Rapier? And sometimes there've been some that are spot on, like to the detail that I was amazed that they knew. And there were some that just completely hallucinated information. I mean, it would say, I'm a writer for the BBC and I live on Kauai in Hawaii, and I just completely wrong information. And that's the danger, with the AIs. They got tremendous potential, and for, optimizing the grid, they've got tremendous potential, but they're
Yeah.
also a huge power drain. And they do hallucinate a lot. I catch people using AIs all the time because I'll say, well, that is factually incorrect. Your AI probably spit that out and you didn't know any better than you repeated it.
It's only as good as the information they're putting into it, right?
Right.
In order to use that. But yeah, I agree with you on the electricity. And I guess that means that, natural gas is going to be around for a while, because I don't think they're going to have windmills and solar panels that are going to be able to generate that much electricity to go into the grid.
Right. I mean, the EIA has done projections, Energy Information Administration, and they were projecting that oil demand, I think, out to 2050
Right.
is going to be flat to down. Coal demand is going to be down. But they projected that the natural gas demand is going to continue to increase. And that's the main reason. We're going to need more and more electricity, and natural gas produces the cleanest, outside of nuclear power, produces the cleanest and firmest electricity that there is. We need to be expanding nuclear. We need to be expanding natural gas if we really want to produce a lot more power at a lower carbon footprint.
So we have a lot of natural gas reserves here in the US, right?
We've got huge natural gas reserves. I remember when fracking was just getting started, I talked to a geologist and I wasn't sure, it was about 2005. And they were, at that time, there were some projections that I thought were completely out of touch with reality. And I talked to a geologist and he said, we have got more natural gas than you can imagine. And he said, once they start to figure this out with the fracking and the horizontal drilling, he said, our natural gas production is going to expand dramatically. And I was very skeptical of his claim, but he's proven right. I mean,
Yeah.
I think natural gas production is up 90 or 100% since 2005.
Yeah.
Massive increase.
I agree with you. And, it just seems like that technology continues to help out. And of course, AI, I'm sure, will be a big part of that. Can you tell us a little bit about your new magazine that you're editor in chief of, and what exactly y'all do?
Sure. So Shale Magazine has been around for a while. I took over as editor in chief in mid-February, and we cover the energy sector. We cover, it's not, it says the title is Shale Magazine, but we cover everything. We cover, nuclear and renewables, and but with a focus on the oil and gas industry, and particularly the dramatic increases in production that have happened over the past 15 years. I write a lot about that. Our writers write a lot about that, but we do cover the entire energy space. We have a podcast that goes out on, in fact, it's on the radio in the Houston area. I think every Sunday night in the Oil Patch Radio, and we've got different guests every week. And it's our CEO Kim Bellotto. She's got designs on expanding that and growing
Right.
it to be the premier oil and gas magazine in the country.
That's great. So what are your thoughts on nuclear?
So I always am cautious with this. I say, look, we cannot afford a Chernobyl. We cannot afford a Fukushima, but we can design plants that are fail-safe plants. And I always give an example of an electrical fuse as a fail-safe design. So if you got too much power running through a fuse, it melts the fuse, the power stops, it shuts down in a safe state. Neither Fukushima nor Chernobyl were fail-safe designs. And we have the ability to make those, but we have a very skeptical public. I think nuclear is so important for a world that is going to increase power demands over time. And nuclear can produce zero carbon electricity. And that's going to be really critical for anybody that is really, really serious about reining in carbon emissions. And they think, wind and solar is going to do it all. They really need to be taking a serious look at nuclear. And I tell a lot of people, I say, I don't think you've done the math. If you think that wind and solar are going to do all the heavy lifting here, even in a wildly optimistic scenario, you're talking about decades from now before that could even be reality. Nuclear provides firm power. You can build a nuclear plant that can replace a coal-fired power plant. You can't do that with wind and solar. You're not going to put a solar plant in and replace the firm power of a coal-fired power plant in a centralized location. A nuclear power plant could do that. A natural gas plant could do that. So, I'm very bullish on nuclear, but we have made it hard for nuclear in the U.S. And, it's been hard after the disasters at Chernobyl and Fukushima. The world momentum for nuclear really declined. And it's understandable. I mean, I tell people, look, I support nuclear, but you cannot have an accident happen where somebody knocks on your door and says, you have to leave your home forever because, we just had a meltdown and this area is going to be radioactive now for the next 100 years. So you've got to grab what you can, get out. You're homeless now.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think the first thing they ought to do is change the name of it, right? So it's not like a nuclear bomb. So, call it green energy or whatever they want to call it. I think people would get a lot more on board with it. But I'm 100% in agreement with you that, if we are going to move away in the future from hydrocarbons, then we have got to input nuclear into that strategy.
Right. It's very important. And I say it's most important for the world that China does it, because China is still consuming more than half the world's coal. And most of the growth in carbon dioxide emissions are coming from Southeast Asia, with China and India leading the pack. U.S. emissions over the past 50 years are not that much different. If you look 50 years ago, we're not producing a lot more CO2 than we did then. Well, maybe a little bit less, but it's in the range of where it was 50 years ago. If you look at Asia, their carbon emissions are just sloped like this. I mean, every year they're growing, and ours have been like this for 50 years. Been down over the past 15, but pretty steady, and it's just night and day if you look at Asia. So it's really important that Asia rein in its carbon emissions, and if China and India could build nuclear plants, fail-safe nuclear plants to shut down coal plants, the world would be doing the world a great, great favor.
I agree. So, Robert, can you tell our listeners how to follow you?
Sure. You can find me in several places. Like I said, I'm an editor-in-chief now at Shale Magazine. I'm still a senior contributor at Forbes. So, you can usually find a new article a week by me at Forbes. And then, I write a lot about investments. I've been writing about energy investments for many years, but I also write about the utility sector, and I write about covered calls, in stock market for Investing Daily. I've got 3 subscription newsletters there. And, we got more than 20,000 subscribers there at Investing Daily.
Well, thank you for coming on the show today. I'd love to have you back in the future.
Anytime. I love to talk about energy.
Thanks.
This podcast is a presentation of Rich Dad Media Network.